Good afternoon. You're watching News9. I'm Qatari. The top story that we're tracking at this hour: in a major relief for 8 former Indian Navy officers stuck in Qatar, the death sentence earlier handed out to them has now been commuted to jail terms. The decision was announced by the Court of Appeals in Qatar in presence of family members of the Navy personnel. Now, Indian ambassador to Qatar was also present in the room when the case was being heard. Commutation of sentence does not mean that officers have been absolved of conviction. Their sentence has been reduced to a lighter punishment. The Indian Ministry of External Affairs in a statement informed the detailed judgment is still awaited and that the ministry will continue to take up the matter further with Qatari authorities. But in a major diplomatic win for India, the death sentence now stands commuted. Joining me in the newsroom, in the studio, is my senior colleague Sandeep Punithan. Sandeep, what does it really mean for the Indian government and for the naval officers who are still there?
Well, Shweta, it's a big day, I think, for not only the government of India, but also for the families of these 8 naval personnel who've been, literally negotiating a death sentence for the last 16 months. The men were picked up in August of last year. And ever since, I mean, they've just not given any papers, nothing to say that these are the formal charges that were made against them. They were arrested on charges.
Espionage charges.
Absolutely. And you normally in a court of law, when in any country in the world which has a fair justice system, you are given papers, you are shown the charges, the charge sheet. Here there was nothing of that sort given. They were literally trussed up and thrown into solitary confinement, and the families were never told about what they were charged with. There were allegations of espionage and all kinds of things, and this is what they had to deal with for the last 16 months. And you can only imagine what they must have been going through since last August. And this is actually a very big win, and not only for the government of India, that's actually used very quiet diplomacy to work on the Qatari government. And I want to draw your attention to that photograph that came out of COP28 when Prime Minister Modi met the Qatari Sheikh Al Thani, and that very warm photograph of them talking together, which I think there was a lot that was left unsaid. Absolutely, that there must have been some behind the scenes diplomacy, very quiet diplomacy at work, and which is also the reason why the government kind of downplayed this thing on families. They didn't bring the families out, and the way that they would normally in other cases. They were asked to keep it quiet because the government was working on something, and this clearly indicates that this was the case. And the fact that these death sentences have been commuted to life imprisonment shows it's a very, very big win, not only for the government of India, but also for the families. It's a huge relief for them after the hell that they've been through for the last 16 months.
Absolutely, huge relief for the family members. Also joining us on the bulletin is Aditya Rajkol, Executive Editor, TV9. We also have Pramit Pal Chaudhary, Foreign Affairs Expert, joining us on the show. Before I come to you, Aditya, let me quickly get in Pramit. Pramit, thank you for taking time out. What does it really mean for the Navy officers who are still there? The commutation of sentence essentially means that they will be jail term further to this. They will not be punished. They will not be eventuality will not mean that they're going to die. Are they going to come back? That is the big question hanging in the air at the moment. Are family members looking to get those Navy officers back anytime soon?
In Qatar, basically, the royal family makes all the calls. So my sense would be that for whatever reason that this case developed in the way that it did, the Qataris have received something from the Indian side, which they probably always wanted in the first place, and that was sort of implicit in this entire business. Having got that, they may allow the 8 sailors to consider some minor jail sentence, and then wait for some period, normally during a holy day or a festival, to basically just give them a pardon and let them go home. That's what I would see, because a commutation of, if they are to be declared guilty of espionage, then the commutation doesn't make any sense. But if they're not guilty at all, then there's no reason to keep them. So I would expect that at some point, when this is off the front pages, if you wish, some sort of a pardon would be provided by the royal family. The question I think for the rest of us would be to find out what exactly did the Indian government have to concede, or what type of deal was struck to get this.
All right, before we discuss what kind of deal was struck, whether it's softer diplomacy, whether there was an actual exchange of people of terms of negotiations, Aditya, I think 16 months were very, very difficult for the family members of those naval officers. We now know that they will not at least be going through a very strict ardent punishment. The charges were not very clear. Come to think of it, very vague espionage charges. It wasn't really clear what were they found guilty of.
Well, that's right, Shweta. What we know as of now is that it's certainly a big diplomatic victory for India. Prime Minister Narendra Modi and External Affairs Minister Jaishankar, as well as the National Security Advisor Ajit Doval, have been working with their partners very closely over the last few months, especially after August. And in November, there was a court of appeal. An appeal was filed, which has been heard today in front of the Indian ambassador and the family members of the former 8 Navy personnel. And it's a big relief, really, because imagine the kind of state that they were in. They were put in solitary confinement, just like Sandeep mentioned, not being given consular access, and the family members were not able to meet them, perhaps have a phone call once a month. So it's also a difficult situation, both for the 8 former Navy personnel and the families as well. We have to also realize here that Qataris are tough negotiators. Negotiations are a part of their foreign policy. You had some historic deals that have happened in Qatar, in Doha itself, the biggest of which is the Taliban and US Doha agreement that was achieved. But in the last few weeks and months, there has been steady movement after Prime Minister actually met the Emir of Qatar. And there was some give and take that really happened that resulted in what has happened today. A lot of things that happened during these espionage cases is that the media attention is not required when the government-to-government negotiations are happening. And that's what the Indian government has ensured, that the family should not come out in media. There shouldn't be much talk about the case. So much hasn't come out in the media, but there's been steady success. I personally believe that in the next few months, I'm hopeful that they will get a pardon. It could happen perhaps in a year or a 2 years period, but it will certainly happen because Qataris want business. Qataris want some kind of, their end of the bargain to be met, and perhaps that will be done in due course, and there will be perhaps a positive news for all the former 8 Navy personnel.
All right, positive news, but to come to this positive news, people have waited with bated breath, at least the family members, with a flurry of events that happened prior to this. You had the External Affairs Minister talking about it. You had an initiation, an attempt being made by the government, a very concerted effort being made by the government to negotiate, to bargain hard, and whatever that would entail. Apart from the soft diplomacy, Sandeep, tell us what led to this. What sort of efforts did we see from Indian government?
Well, as Pramit was mentioning, Shweta, I think they worked on the Qataris at all levels, whether it's diplomatic at the highest levels, Prime Minister Modi being involved, and I'm sure a lot of it had to do with access to Indian markets as well. We won't know the full story until a few months from now, but you can take it for sure that there was intense negotiations at all levels of government to achieve this, and the very fact, the circumstances of this case itself, how the murky circumstances around this case, the way they were picked up and all that suggests that this was actually meant to lead to some kind of negotiations, that the Qataris wanted something from India. These are all the possibilities that opens up. And as Aditya said, Qataris are very good negotiators. Their entire foreign policy is built on this whole thing of they're punching above their weight because they're negotiators, and they've hosted some incredible people like the Taliban there, Hamas, and they're all in Qatar, and you can imagine a country like that which hosts not only the Taliban in the past, 10 years ago, and now Hamas, the entire Hamas leadership, what kind of tough negotiators they would be. And these are definitely going to be the kind of facts that we will look forward to in the next months, if at all someone decides to spill the beans on what actually happened, the behind the scenes negotiations that the Indian government did with Qatar. But you know, the larger point, Shweta, is, and it's a heartening one, is that the government has, in recent years, it's adopted this policy of leave no Indian behind. And that's been a cornerstone of their foreign policy, whether it is someone who's stuck in a trumped up espionage charge, as is the case in Qatar, or it's Indians left stranded in a war zone, or you know, caught up in some kind of litigation or stranded. Anyway, the government rushes, and we see a more responsive government. There's an all-of-government approach. There's an effort to bring Indians back, which is not to say that this was not the case earlier, but as of now, there's a more proactive all-of-government approach to ensure that Indians are brought back wherever they are.
Absolutely, all-out government approach to bring back Indians, and an immense success there in at least ensuring that the 8 naval officers, their sentence is commuted. I believe Pramit continues to be with us. Pramit, you know, you hinted at Qataris being tough negotiators apart from Aditya. What sort of exchange are we looking at? I mean, you know, it could be a very interesting story to hear, as Sandeep is pointing out, maybe days and months after it's over, after those naval officers are back in India. But what are we looking at, by the way, of a diplomatic effort being made by India? What may have went behind? We know Qatar is a very strong economic partner of India, as well as the ties between the two countries are stronger than ever. We saw that photograph emerging with Qatari Emirate in COP28. In light of all of that, what sort of negotiations are we looking at? It is a win. It is a win for India, and it's a win for softer diplomacy, as many would say.
So the Qataris are, the Qataris play hardball. They have been supporters of terrorist groups like the Islamic State. They have continued to be one of the biggest backers of the Taliban, and they've also supported the Hamas. But at the same time, they've then worked with those countries that these same groups target. So they also they were one of the first Gulf countries to reach out to the Israelis and allowed them at one point at least to have an economic an economic liaison office in Qatar. They allow the U.S. to maintain one of the largest military bases in the Persian Gulf, even while supporting the Islamic State, which was attacking, and Taliban fighters who were attacking the American forces in Afghanistan. So they play these games. It's a game they can play because they have enormous amounts of money and because they are in the natural gas superpower of the world, so nobody can touch them. So my guess would be, and these are straws in the wind right now, they had a similar list of requests or demands that they wanted of India. And part of this, and we can only speculate, one of them definitely, I think, because they've asked other countries as well to consider recognizing the Taliban or working more closely with the Taliban regime. They've been at the forefront of trying to get other governments, much more so even than Pakistan, who in fact has a bad relationship with the Taliban, to get them to accept the Taliban, when India has been moving in that direction, if only because that's what the reality requires us to. They are, of course, they provide 50% of the natural gas to India, of our imports of natural gas. They are our biggest source of natural gas, crucial to both our industry, our fertilizers, and so on. They've been pushing harder for long-term contracts from India in natural gas rather than spot purchases. And India has begun slowly. Petronet, which is a consortium of Indian firms, and GAIL have over the past few months come closer and closer to such long-term contracts. Whether this was part of that equation is harder to tell, because that would seem to be purely commercial. They've also been a little worried about what we are doing with the United Arab Emirates and with Saudi Arabia. We've seen the ITU-2 connectivity corridor with the United Arab Emirates being announced, the Emiratis promising to invest $50 billion in India, Saudi Arabia following that up with IMEC and promising a $40 billion investment in India. Qatar, you may remember, in 2015, had tried to come up with a similar proposal and promised $30 billion in investments to India. Not much happened after that. And it is not inconceivable that they are a little peeved that India has focused itself on 2 other countries in the Gulf to whom they are rivals, rather than looking at them. But I said whether these are the reasons for what has happened here is hard to tell. It's quite likely with the Qataris you can be running on several tracks at the same time, and these tracks will be completely independent of each other.
All right, so a lot of history there between India and Qatar, but Qatar must have played hardball. That is anybody's guess here. But the good news at the end of all of this is that 8 naval officers, their death sentence, seem to have commuted. They are currently will be serving life imprisonment. That's the news coming in at this point in time. We're not so sure of what happens to their future, but hopefully sooner rather than later, all of them will be back to where they belong, and that is the Indian soil. Pramit Pal, Aditya Raj Kaul, thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you for taking time out for joining us here on News9, as well as to you, Sandeep. Thank you for taking time out. And with that, it's a wrap on the show. We'll be back in just a bit.